We take food for granted. It's easy to get whenever we want it. And if we don't want to cook for ourselves, there are always restaurants or takeaways. So it's easy to forget that while food is readily obtainable for most people in Britain, there are millions of people in other parts of the world who are never sure where their next meal will come from, or whether it will come at all. Last year, 15 million children under the age of 5 died of hunger. At the present time, there are about 4,500 million people living on the Earth. By the year 2050, there could be over 11,000 million. How are we going to feed these people? Even today, we don't properly feed over 1/5 of the world's population. Scientists reckon that the average working man should take in about 10,000 kilojoules per day. The absolute minimum is about 6,500. In the USA, the average intake is over 13,000, whereas in some third world countries, it's as low as 7,000. But for young children, the usual daily calorie intake is far, far lower. Most of the starving people live in what is being called the third world. The term third world has been used recently to describe developing countries, usually in the southern hemisphere. Whatever name we give to them, these are countries with large rural populations which depend more on farming than industry. In third world countries, people often die much earlier than they do in this country. Many of them suffer from hunger and malnutrition. We are used to having a variety of food. Almost by accident, we have a balanced diet with enough nutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins and mineral salts. But in the third world, the diet of many people is often made up of just one type of food. There's a danger that such a diet will be unbalanced, lacking some of the vital nutrients. These children are not fat because they've eaten too much. They are suffering from a disease, partly caused by a lack of protein. Again, there are recommendations about the amount of protein the average working man needs and about the critical minimum. Countries differ enormously. But in many countries of the third world, the protein intake is dangerously low. Again, the situation for children is often much worse, despite the fact that they need lots of protein to help their bodies grow. There are 800 million starving people in the third world, yet Europe has vast food surpluses, mountains of spare food. Why do these exist?
Every year the farm ministers from the 10 EEC countries meet and they fix minimum prices for food like cereals and beef and so on. And if the farmer can't sell for that, then the EEC will buy off him. So that means that as much as he produces, he knows he can sell. So he goes on growing and producing more and more food.
So what do the surpluses consist of?
Really every kind of food that you can think of. The main problem is too many Euro cows producing too much milk, so there's a 1 million ton surplus of butter, which is the equivalent of about 4,000 million packets of butter, and around 1 million tons of skim milk powder, plus a lot of beef, cereals and sugar, and of course the legendary wine lake.
There are also huge mountains of surplus fruit and vegetables. These are just ploughed into the ground or left in the open to rot. These vast mountains of surplus food could be sent to the millions of starving in the third world. But how appropriate is this surplus food for use in the third world?
Well, cereals is extremely useful. Some of the other produce isn't really appropriate at all, like butter or wine, for example. Fruit and vegetables would be okay, but they're difficult to get there because they're so perishable. Quite a lot of skim milk powder does go to third world countries, but that's only safe if you've got really clean water to add it to. In many of these places they haven't. And if you add skim milk powder to dirty water, it's going to cause a lot of disease. The other disadvantage of promoting skim milk powder is it sometimes discourages mothers from breastfeeding children, and that breastfeeding does to some extent give children immunity against some diseases, or at least protects them to some extent.
So there are some surprising problems in giving our surplus food to the hungry people of the Third World. Lardy in France is the home of the American writer Susan George, who has some different views.
Food aid is useful when people are really starving. By that I mean a crisis period, a limited period of time, and usually for specific groups, because one finds that women, small children, older people are the first to suffer when there are food shortages.
Another problem with food aid is that it can discourage local people from producing their own food.
People don't always understand that the food aid which comes into a country from the outside can very well be in competition with local production. Local farmers bring their harvests to the market, and what do they find? The price has plummeted because their own harvests are in competition with foreign food that's been brought in, and it's free or it is priced abnormally low. So those farmers locally can't compete. And finally, it can be extremely dangerous because it creates dependency and it's costly. So countries become dependent on outside food, and then they must purchase it commercially, and they have to make huge outlays of cash in order to be able to buy the food.
So food aid is apparently only really suitable in emergencies. It was realized that the answer lay not in sending more food, but in helping the local people to produce food for themselves. In the early 1940s, Dr. Norman Borlaug, head of an agricultural research project in Mexico, started a revolution, the Green Revolution. New strains of crops such as wheat and rice were produced by artificially breeding together some of the existing varieties. The scientists were hoping to produce new varieties which gave higher yields and could survive in harsh climates. Biological research is difficult. There are lots of different variables to be controlled. Factors such as soil type, temperature, and day length can make a considerable difference. The results of the experiments can only be seen when trial batches of the new seeds are grown and measured. Some of the varieties turned out to be highly successful, producing even greater yields than the scientists had hoped for. A very few varieties, were even called miracle varieties, and from them scientists collected miracle seeds. It was these seeds that were sent all over the world. It was these seeds which started the Green Revolution. At the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex University, Michael Lipton has been looking at the success of this type of research.
Now in India you've got getting on for 700 million people now, and not far short of 600 million of those depend on agriculture, and that means mainly growing food to live. If it weren't for the high-yielding varieties, India would now be growing somewhere between 10 and 20 million tons of food a year less. So that whatever may be said for or against the Green Revolution, these high-yielding varieties of cereals have certainly saved millions of lives in India alone. They haven't created paradise, but if it were not for the contribution of agricultural research in India and in many other countries of the developing world, very many more poor people who are alive today would instead be dead.
800 million starving in the third world. Hear the babies crying, stomach with no food. Can you hear us, Father? Listen to our words. We are like the others, yeah, children of this earth. So I say, why are we so poor while others are so rich? Food
Although more food is produced as a result of the Green Revolution, it's not working as well as it could. Susan George believes it helps a few rich farmers, but not the starving majority.
Yes, it's a success for the better off farmers who have been able to buy the pesticides, the fertilizers, the irrigation equipment that are needed to make what they call the miracle seeds grow. But they are only miracle seeds if they get the proper kinds of inputs to make them grow. So if you have the money, if you have the bank credit, if you have the wherewithal to plant that kind of seed and to use it, as has been the case for the richer farmers in Asia and Latin America mostly, then yes, the Green Revolution has been a success.
Nothing's straightforward. And again, unfortunately, it seems as if it's the poorest people who suffer most.
But the social side is something else, because the Green Revolution has had a great many effects on poorer people. They have lost employment because the richer farmers have bought tractors, which replace huge numbers of agricultural laborers. They've lost their land because the richer farmers have been able to buy it up with the profits that they have made growing Green Revolution grain. And the overall result has been concentration of land in fewer hands, concentration of wealth in fewer hands. And if you don't have employment, in other words, a job with income, and if you don't have land, then you can't grow your food and you can't purchase it. So you're going to go hungry if you can't grow your food or buy it.
In many third world countries today, farmers are growing crops like cotton or coffee. These are no use as food to the starving poor. So why has this happened?
Partly it exists because the governments of the poor countries themselves are not really very interested in their poor majorities. They are interested in the people who keep them in power, which is to say people who largely live in cities. They are interested not so much in growing food as in having export crops which will bring in revenues to the state and which will allow them to buy a certain number either of necessary goods or of luxury goods. So what these governments frequently do is devote their best land, their best resources, to producing what are called cash crops, which is to say crops that can be sold on outside markets for hard currency, for cash.
So it would appear that the governments of many developing countries have concentrated on growing cash crops and not on growing crops for food.
Take a country like Upper Volta in the Sahel, which we all know is one of the greatest centers of hunger in the world today. Since independence in 1960, Upper Volta has increased its cotton production by 32 times, by a factor of 32. But sorghum and millet production is exactly at the same level that it was at 25 years ago. In other words, the investments have been made in crops that will bring in a return, but the return doesn't go to the people who produce the crops. They get a very small proportion.
The price of crops is often fixed by governments, and the price is often low. So the poor people don't earn enough money to go and buy their own food. For them, the situation gets worse and worse. They neither grow their own food or earn enough to buy some. Even governments find it difficult to be sure that the right aid is going to the right people.
Our view is that the really important thing is what we call development. In other words, helping the countries to develop their own agricultures so that they can feed themselves rather than having to rely on emergency food supplies coming in. If we look at our aid program, there's a lot of emphasis on agriculture, on preserving natural resources and developing them. We're heavily involved in the process of irrigation, making water available, which is tremendously important. We support some very good agricultural research. We're engaged in training schemes. We send out experts to the countries concerned to help advise. And equally, of course, we train people over here.
Some projects have failed because they used inappropriate technology. Here they tried to bring Texas ranching methods to Upper Volta. The scheme was doomed to failure because the people didn't have the knowledge or the money to maintain the machinery.
we still see things going wrong. It's a difficult world to operate in. We know that in Africa, for instance, there are great political difficulties, there are great difficulties to do with the drought and so on. And I don't want to leave a rosy-eyed impression, but I do believe that we and the other major aid operations around the world nowadays do keep a very close eye on what is happening. We really do monitor what's going on. We take tremendous care in the planning and operation of it. And I think as a result, the quality of the aid has risen considerably over the years.
So that's the sort of thing that governments can do. Is there anything that we can do?
One of the things I think is very useful is the so-called School Link program. For example, Warwick has got 14 schools linked with the Bow district in Sierra Leone. And a school link means that people write to each other, find out about each other's lives and problems, maybe send each other's certain things that each other wants. It's not a charity exercise. I don't want this to be confused with a charity exercise. It's an exercise in learning about each other and each other's problems, and maybe being able to begin to help each other. Eventually there are exchanges, people go and live in each other's villages or towns for a short while, perhaps during the vacation. And that way, gradually, people get to learn about each other, and that's a very useful thing. It's organized by Oxfam and by voluntary service overseas in this country. And it's something that I very strongly recommend people to get involved in if they want to learn how to help.
So it's the rural poor who are suffering most in the third world. They have neither land, nor jobs, nor food. And the danger is that things are going to get worse. Is there anything that can be done?
A lot is said, and rightly, about bad aid, aid that doesn't work, aid that in extreme cases makes poor people poorer. Nobody's ever said that about aid to agricultural research. Aid to third world agricultural research, especially in food crops for smallholders, is the most cost-effective form of aid that a developed country can give. Now, whatever one may think of aid, and I can think of lots of pros and cons, there's a lot to be said for aid to agriculture and to small-scale irrigation in general, but there is an enormous amount to be said for really using money in support of cost-effective small farm food crop research. And the world system as a whole is not doing very well at that.
We desperately need a more balanced and a more humane system between the North and South. But even if we get that, that's not necessarily going to help the poorest people at the bottom of the pile. And that is why I go always back to the single word, power. Anything that we can do as citizens which will get the aid, get the development projects directly to those people is going to be a help. Anything that we do which strengthens those who already control the world's resources is going to push those people further and further below that line of, that point of no return, which is starvation.
Millions of dollars are spent on arms, not helping the world, only to do harm. Why not distribute the money, feed the poor? Come on, help my children, 'cause they're knocking on death's door. Strengthen the weak and weaken the strong. Redistribution of power